Cool. All right. Hello and welcome to Sprint 63 review. Standard 2-week sprint. Next slide. So, as customary, I'll give the overview of the sprint. Carol will give us an update on the community, Jason on architecture, Dan on the classic UI, Chris on the service UI, Bronagh on providers, Tina on automate, Gregg T on platform, Alberto on API, and Chris on documentation. Slide. All right, so this sprint we saw a big trend down in terms of number of PRs merged. Still investigating why. But we saw 111 PRs merged in the core repo, main repo, 79 in the classic UI, 76 in the integration tests, and then everything below 20 everywhere else. We also saw a new repository this sprint. Julian extracted the nuage provider to a separate repo. Next slide, please. The distribution was good. 36% were bugs, 36% enhancements, and the rest evenly distributed around the other third. So really good distribution of types of PRs across all the different repositories. Next slide. So that's where you see the big drop down we mentioned. I think that in the previous sprint, the number was, it says here 493, but I think last time it was a bit lower. So we adjusted upwards based on a recalculation. We did the calculation several times on the 410 number, and that's the number that we came back with. We will double check again before next sprint, but not sure why the downtrend. Next slide. So this is the health report, and John has reformatted this thing to, I think, become a bit more readable and useful to all of us. So before it was just showing the various scores on each repository, but not how they changed from the previous time. So John figured out a way to kind of add that information in. Green is good, red is bad. So you can start seeing how the various repos are changing. This list is sorted in alphabetical order by repository. Probably the most notable change here is the classic UI number of issues went down by 228. Those are the code climate issues. So that's a pretty big number. So yeah, we'll continue to monitor this. I think this is an interesting metric to look after. Next slide, please. All right, over to Carol on the community.
Hi, thanks, Oleg.
Sure.
Yep. So, well, first of all, greetings from London. I'm in London right now because we have the Expo Fest coming up tomorrow. And, well, it's also on the slide. We'll have a ManageIQ presence there, and we hope to, talk to some people and hope to get more interest and show some other about the integration we have with Expo in the latest version of ManageIQ. So that's about the events. Going back a bit, last week in ManageIQ, I listed 3 here, even though it has been 2 weeks, because the last time I did not manage to add Julian's post to the sprint slides before the cutoff time. So here it is. So the recent ones are by Marcel and Daniel. Thanks for that. And then one of the cool additions we have to the website is multiple branches of the user reference documentation. Now you can switch between them very easily, thanks to Eric Hayes for adding this feature in. So you can switch between AOL file and the latest release if you go to documentation, user reference. So check it out if you haven't already. And well, that's all for this week. So thanks. And next slide, please.
Okay. First off, the website documentation thing, it's really cool. You can like actually bring up one version and then click to a different version, see the doc at the same time, so you can actually see how it changed over time, which is really neat. On the architecture side, start with the podification group. For the past sprint, they built a separate pod serving up the Apache HTTPD stuff. And what's nice about that is in order to get rid of the need for privileged containers, we're trying to see if we can move them into smaller containers that maybe only those need higher privilege, but not the whole darn system. So this HTTPD pod serves up the auth stuff, which needs some of that higher privilege. And Alberto also put together some stuff to access the dbus via kind of a microservice API. And that seems to be actually working out really well. So I think we're going to move forward with that. So the new architecture that they've come up with there is that the initial HTTP pod would do the auth stuff and do your initial authorization, and then forward off to a pod that does UI specifically. That UI pod we can scale up and down. And then separately, they're going to have a separate pod for scaling backend workers. This is for the G release, all of this effort. Eventually, when we get to the H release, I think the goal is that each worker will actually be a separate pod, or maybe even something different where those can scale independently. So that's where they got the past 2 weeks. On the worker management front, a lot of work has been done at looking at trying to make the workers and code run as a non-Rails environment. So a lot of it is they want to get rid of controllers, for example, when you're running a worker that's talking to VMware. It kind of doesn't make sense. So that's how they're slimming down some of the memory and GC times and things like that. So a lot of work is actually finding places where we do things like Rails.root and then dealing with that because Rails doesn't exist. Database stuff, settings, they've been looking at pretty much across the board logging all these little parts and making changes to them so that they can be run in non-Rails environments. Joe R. Made a change to get us back to kernel spawn for launching our workers. We were doing fork for a long time, and fork we thought would have benefits, but it doesn't really have as many benefits as we thought. We don't get the copy on write that we need it. Additionally, if we're going to treat workers as separate containers, we got to be able to launch them completely independently. So that was a change to the interface to get us back to spawning the workers. Joe's also been working on bundler groups, which is going through all of the gems and grouping them into kind of which functionalities need which gems. So for example, you can say the VMware gem needs the VMware web service, but the UI doesn't. And then we can tell bundler, hey, I'm running a UI worker, only include these groups, and it completely eliminates entire classes of gems. So it gets the memory down quite a bit. I think he saw really ridiculous numbers. He was getting something like 200 megs down to like 80 megs just with that. So yeah, he's going to keep working through that. The next thing was they also looked at worker heartbeats via the file system, a POC of that. Part of the reason for that is containers are self-contained, and Kubernetes can do liveness checks on those containers, but we need a way to kind of communicate, a worker saying that it's alive. So they tried doing something where they touch a file, and then we can use liveness checks to check that the M time of the file, essentially. So they've done a POC of that, and we'll probably see more of that moving forward. Another thing the Kubernetes team did was they took a break from the codification stuff and looked at a replacement for logging. One of the challenges with running tons of containers is the logs, and how do you collect them? How do you merge them together? How do you deal with a customer that has hundreds of these things running and trying to find a problem that may be jumping around from container to container? So they've been looking at the EFK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Fluentd, and Kibana. Basically what that is the container will write its logs to standard out in JSON format, and then Fluentd can watch all the standard outs of all the containers grab them all in, parse the JSONs, and send them over to Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch is essentially like a full text search database. And Kibana is a visualization tool that's been written on top of Elasticsearch so that you can search, filter, do whatever you need to find the information in the logs that you're looking for. So they did a quick spike of that, and it was actually quite successful. So that might be the direction that we go. Next slide, please. Yeah, I got quite a lot. On the inventory side, they've been focusing on batch save and parallel save, so different ways of saving the data to kind of minimize the database interactions that we have to see if they can improve the performance. Additionally, what parallel save might get us is that they don't have to keep the entire inventory of memory at once, but instead can keep smaller sections, save it, and then move on to the next section, or save them in parallel. And they've been finding some good numbers with that. They've been found that even with large inventories, they can keep the memory relatively stable, which is really nice. Obviously, at the cost of how fast you get it into the database. So they're going to continue researching that. There's been work on the OpenShift side to switch over to the graph refresh. That's ongoing work, and hopefully the purpose of that is that once they have graph refresh, then we can do comparisons between the non-graph refresh and the graph refresh and the different batch saves and parallel saves to see kind of, we have two things to compare to each other to move forward to see if it's actually making a difference. Adam, I believe, worked on the direct to refresh event handlers. The idea there is that the way refresh works now, or kicking off a refresh works, is we get an event, it goes to the event handler, then it goes through automate, and automate says, hey, go refresh. And that kind of loop takes a long time. It also puts a lot of pressure on automate because automate's running a lot of stuff. It doesn't really need to run. So the idea was having a separate event handler or something that watches the event stream independently of the event catcher, and it just waits for events that it knows it needs to do refreshes on. So it's more direct. And I think that's shown some benefits. It also, when I get down to events, it also helped drive some of the ideas behind the event architecture. And finally, they've been doing some database index optimizations, and I think they'll be continuing with that. The metrics team, they've been focusing on trying to break the problem down, and they've divided the problem domain into short-term metrics and long-term metrics, realizing that the way we use those things are very, very different. And so the solutions may actually be different. On the short-term side, we did a lot of investigation on Prometheus. Prometheus is a, I hesitate to say time series database because you can't actually insert time data with your own timestamp, and that's actually the fundamental problem with it for us. So they're more focused on live monitoring, so they get metrics from all different places and they kind of do monitoring and alerting. For us, we get the data from a third party with dates that aren't ours, right? So we have to insert it in, and we found that it's just not quite the right fit if we continue with real-time metrics the way we're doing it now. So that's another thing we may look at is how maybe we're doing it wrong. Maybe we should be doing it differently. And the other thing they worked on was investigating how to capture metrics without the queue. We're finding that the queue is our biggest bottleneck. So there's been some investigation on a lot of the teams to try to avoid the queue. Maybe there's ways we can just do direct, hence the direct to refresh handlers, and we're going to do it on the metric side, and you're going to see it for some other efforts as well. And one of those efforts is events. They were actually looking at using pub/sub techniques to try to capture the events and throw them into a pub/sub stream, and then different I don't know what you call them, subscribers can be watching the screen for the stream for different purposes. So one might be the refresh that we talked about, the direct to refresh. The other one is just storing it in our database. So you have a guy who's just looking at it just to store it for timeline purposes, and another one could be for automate, who only knows about, I only care about these events for automation because that's what the user has set up for automation. So we got a general plan for that, and I believe we're going to be POCing that in the following sprint. Next slide, please. Last one, MIQQ. They are, one interesting technique that they're doing is reorganizing the queue usage from zone role to service affinity. What that means is typically when we use the queue, we put something to a zone or to a role or to a zone and a role. And we realized that the real reason we're doing that is because we want affinity to some particular resource. So we may need to have, public internet access or public access to the cloud, or we need access to a specific vSphere. So they're looking at more changing it to, I want to do operations, that's the service, and the affinity is for this EMS. And that is a much different way of doing the routing, and it's much more, as they've gone through the code, they've actually found places where we were actually not quite doing it right. So that was really eye-opening, and I'm looking forward to see how that work moves forward. Removing usages of put or update and put unless exists. Those are two methods that really mess with how we can get off of our queue. We go back and we re-introspect what's on the queue, and we manipulate it sometimes. And that's not normal with queuing systems. So they're looking at all the places that we do that and seeing if we can either get rid of it or minimize it or change it to something else entirely, like a state machine or something. I know they've gotten rid of a few or minimized a few, and they're going to continue with that as well. And the last bit is Bill's been looking into ActiveMQ and ActiveMQ Artemis as a full-on replacement for our MIQ-Q. Artemis can do pub sub as well as normal classic queue type operations. And I think you've been seeing quite a bit of benefits with that. So the research is going to continue, and hopefully we'll have a POC of that next sprint. And that was a lot of words. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Jason. Over to Dan.
Take a breather there, Jason.
Wow, I need a water.
All right, so in the UI, basically you can see here a lot of bugs were fixed. We did squeeze in some enhancements though, so it was a pretty good sprint for that. We're trying to gear up for some of the projects coming up for the G release, so you should see enhancements improving over the next few sprints. On the refactoring side, we definitely have more progress going on getting to using controller as, trying to head towards Angular 2/4. We moved the custom font, some more custom font icons into the Font Fabulous repo. We're trying to get those out of our repo and into a better place. On the enhancement side, several physical infrastructure updates. That group has been working really well and just keeps cranking out changes and new UI enhancements. I'll show one here where they're displaying the host in the topology screen. And quite a few, I saw quite a few PRs modifying summary screens. So you can just kind of read through the list there. I mean, various places, here's clouds, even VMs and providers and stuff. So pretty good. Next screen. Next slide. All right, so you can see there where we were using our own custom fonts icons and moving them now into the Font Fabulous repo, so we can grab them all from there and share them with anybody else who's using that repo. So that's pretty nice. We're trying to get everything centralized and get everything out of custom areas inside the product. Next screen. And here you can see they've added hosts into the topology for physical infrastructure, and I think there's actually a PR that will extend that to show the VMs under each host as well. So that's probably upcoming next spring. And that's it. Off to Chris.
Thanks, Dan. So just to start, quick breakdown of the sprint. We've got 14 stories with 3 bugs, 2 new features, and 9 chore tasks completed. Included kind of a breakdown as to where stuff was. Of course, the bulk was adding some tests, a couple UX things, some housekeeping, 2 details, a couple catalog items, branding, and notifications, and 1 technical debt. Next slide, please. Talking about the new features, the first new feature from Chris I'd like to show you is the VM utilization graphs in the resource details page. Those can be accessed via the dashboard icon in the upper right. So we've got usage graphs available now on the service level and on the VM resource level. Next slide, please. The next new feature, which Alan did, previously throughout the UI, we had a spattering of either status icons or status messages, and they've kind of been scattered throughout and no rhyme or reason. So we've gone through and completely redone the status indicators. So now they are live updated to indicate what's going on, and they're all the icon view instead of a phrase or word. Of course, if you mouse over, it'll give you what's going on as well. And we've also changed that into a component, and that'll be made available into the components repo shortly. Next slide, please. For the bugs, we mainly focused on a couple usability issues, a couple wrong item counts and items not displaying. For housekeeping, we've updated to pattern fly 4. We've added more unit testing, and we've updated our mock API system with data for chart generation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bronagh.
Thanks, Chris. So I am going to give an update on the provider core team, the Azure provider, SCVMN, Nuage, Popular, OpenStack, and Rev. Next slide, please. So most pull requests this sprint came from the OpenStack provider with 16 merged PRs, followed by a handful of PRs from Rev, Popular, Amazon, and Ansible. Next slide, please. So from the core team, as Jason mentioned, Ladislav made some performance improvements to the concurrent batch saving of inventory to the database. And Julian extracted the Nuage provider to its own repo, together with a dedicated Gitter channel. Next slide, please. And so Daniel added file share support to the SCVMN provider. And that enhances the host inventory gathering and the virtual machine provisioning. And he also added support for 2 new regions, and that's Germany and China. Next slide, please. So from the Hocular team, STI was enabled for the middleware office, and some broken links in the event timelines were fixed. And server and deployment status is now reflected in the color and tooltips in the topology view. Next slide, please. So for OpenStack, the network manager now uses the graph refresh. And then both the Rev team and the Automate team together added support for B2B. So I'm going to play a demo put together by Martin from the Rev team.
So, hello everyone, my name is Martin, and in this video we'll go through the ManageIQ feature of V2V. V2V, as it stands for virtual to virtual, and it means that it's a tool that enables you to convert virtual machine, or more specifically its disks, from one virtualization format to another. So, in ManageIQ, this feature is exposed in the infrastructure VM view, where you can see I have added several providers, one of which is of type VMware. In this screencast, we'll focus on conversion from VMware to Rev. So you see I selected a particular VM from the VMware provider, and a new menu option that is shown that enables me to transform this virtual machine to Rev. So when I click this, dialog will show up that enables me to fill out the necessary details for this. So let's call this V2V screencast. The most important option is to select the target infrastructure provider. This has to be a provider which supports import of such virtual machines, which in our case is are providers of type Rev and of version 4 and above. So I have 2 such providers, so I will select one. Upon selection of the infrastructure provider, I'm able to select more options of the import process. So let's select cluster and storage for the VM where it should be stored. One a bit advanced parameter is the disk allocation policy. So I will check yes to use the free provisioning instead of pre-allocation, which will save some space. And since this is a Windows VM, I will also like to install the necessary drivers to guarantee smooth operation of the VM after the conversion process is complete. So now I am able to submit this request, and since I'm administrator, the request will be approved automatically. So let's look into the Revem UI, where the process of importing should start momentarily. And here we go. Since this process is literally copying all the storage bits, all the disks, and doing also some fancy transformations on top of them, this process can take up to several hours in cases. So let's use the magic of time travel, and we'll be back in a few moments. So, with a bit of time travel magic, we see that the VM has been successfully imported to the ref provider, and also one nice thing is that ManageIQ was smart enough to configure all the VM mix, in this case only one, with appropriate default VM networks. The logic is that it automatically chooses the first VM network of the cluster to which this VM is imported to, so you can start using your virtual machine right away. So, with the drivers, everything. With the drivers installed and the network working, you should be good to go.
Okay, John, would you like to share your screen again?
Yep, he's doing that.
There we go.
Next slide, please. Over to Tina.
Okay, so this past sprint, we've got 24 PRs merged. It's kind of nice that we have almost as many enhancements as the rest of the categories combined. A couple enhancements I'd like to call out on is we do add a custom button support. Basically, he made a change to the Automate engine code to allow multiple objects to be passed to the custom button methods. This gives us the ability in the future to, on the list page view, to select a bunch of VMs and have a single method process them. Lucy did some work on container template provisioning this time. We have a new service template type for the containers, a new automate method that runs the list of provider projects, and dialog generation from container template parameters. What's really exciting about this for me is that this provisioning is going to use the generic state machine. That's the first time we've been able to leverage the work that's already done. Anybody that knows automate knows that the state machine is not a trivial thing to add and all the supporting methods and stuff that you have to do for it. So I'm really excited that this provisioning is going to use that, and hopefully more different types of provisioning will use that in the future. Lucy, this sprint is going to add service models for Automate, and then I think we're left to the UI component for that. As you saw in Martin's great demo that he enhanced the virtual to virtual support, adding enhancement for post-import network configuration. And that's it for Automate. Next slide, please.
Okay, so on the platform side, we had 36 PRs merged, and you can see the breakdown there. And I'll just go through some of the highlights. So for RBAC, as usual, Libor has been busy fixing bugs and adding some more classes to RBAC. You see the second bullet there. Cloud key pairs are now participating in RBAC. And then the first one, this one's hard to describe, but the way all the different types of filters are combined together in RBAC. There's a special case for, I think it's like a self-service type user, where it's either only user or group owned or only user owned VMs. It was doing a union of the other filters with that and actually allowing a user in that category to see more things. So that's been fixed. Small change by Shimon for performance related. So we're not queuing up cap and U collection for objects that don't support it. What it was doing before, it would throw it on the queue and there would be no cap in U, and it would just basically add unnecessary items to the queue, and in some cases that could be a lot of things. We definitely don't want to be doing that, so that should help. Next slide, John. So Joe V made a fix external auth side so that basically he configured a 10-minute cache timeout for SSSD so that any directory changes that are made externally can be reflected in EVM much sooner than the 90 minutes, which is actually the default for SSSD. So I think that's a pretty good improvement. And then just a bunch of miscellaneous things. LJ added memory usage to the worker status. So when you run EVM status or EVM status full, you can see that now. A couple of helper scripts got in also in the tools directory so that you can, from a command line, change the server zone or configure any of the settings that you see in advanced settings. Shimon made a fix for supporting IPv6 for log collection. And the last one there was increasing the timeout for metric purging. It was using the default 10-minute queue timeout, and in a lot of cases, it was timing out and wouldn't, basically, it would fall behind and not purge stuff, and then the metrics would grow and grow. So now it's configurable. The new default is 20 minutes, but it can be raised. And I think that's it for platform. I'll turn it over to Alberto.
Thanks, Greg. So in the API land, we had a couple of enhancements coming in. First one is when we used to create the API resources, you only got the core object attributes, but Jillian made an enhancement so that we also return the href that's API-centric, as you can see here, and creating a group. Next slide, please. Okay. So another fix by Jillian was that when requests came in with invalid attributes, we used to take those as virtual attributes and essentially just don't return anything. So the fix she made was that we actually check against physical and virtual and return a proper 400 with that. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so with Libor did a fix for RBAC. Here, in the API, we were, filtered properly with RBAC, so, you could, we had RBAC checks made on the resource actually being accessed, so that was good. The only thing is we didn't have RBAC checks on fetching the virtual attribute. So while that was okay if you're fetching some virtual attributes, the example here kind of shows you, well, we actually needed it there. So you actually, in the first example, we're picking up a provider and we actually are traversing their relationships here. So that was really important to fix. So great work from Libor. Next slide, please. Alrighty, and yeah, so there was a bug in the querying of a task. So that Jillian fixed this. So the one issue was that we used to provide an alias on the sub collection for some collections for tasks being alias to request tasks. So as you can see on the small example, API provision requests 5 tasks was actually an alias to request tasks. But the problem is semantically that was actually different than if you were to query that sub-resource directly from the primary collection API task. So, so for the next release, we're deprecating this, but it'll still work. For now, we're actually triggering a redirect 301 on those. So as you can see in the examples below, they'll be redirected to the request task equivalent. But the next release after that, then they'll be removed. So that was the fix from Jillian. And I think that's it. Next slide, please.
Over to Chris.
Sorry, Chris had to drop today. This is Steve Bream. I'm covering for him. So you can see we've merged the 8 PRs, 5 enhancements, 3 bug fixes, and focusing mostly now on some of the server roles, diagnostics, and Azure content.
All right. So thanks everyone for all the input on both the work and the slide deck here in the presentation for the sprint review. Next sprint is 3 weeks out, we've decided, because the week of July 3rd, there's the US holiday of the 4th of July, which falls on a Tuesday, and many people, I'm sure, will take the day off on Monday. And also later that week, there are holidays in Brno, so we decided to push the sprint out and add an extra week to it. That's it. Any questions or comments on the room or on the phone? Jeans?
Hey, I think it's Marianne here. I think that should be July 12th, not the 13th. Assuming you still want it to be on a Wednesday.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Time is hard.
Oh, yeah.
We were adjusting for time zones.
Right.
Thanks for the correction, Marianne. The next one's on Wednesday, July 12th. Alrighty. Well, if there's nothing else, thanks everyone.